And welcome to this 8th Engage webinar with the title European Space Policy and EU External Action, a Contested New Frontier. My name is Gustavo Miller. I'm Senior Researcher at the Leuven Center for Global Governance Studies here at KU Leuven in Belgium, which is a partner of the Engage Consortium, and I will be moderating this debate. For those watching us for the first time, Engage is an Horizon 2020 project that looks into how the European Union can effectively and sustainably meet its strategic challenges by utilizing all of its external action tools and by consequence become a more assertive global actor. In a few weeks' time, actually on June 12th, the Engage project will release a white paper on European external action, compiling 3.5 years of insightful research and turning that into useful and actionable recommendations for the European Union to recalibrate its role and place in the world. You can know more about Engage and its upcoming white paper and the various insightful policy briefings that we have produced by checking its website, that is engage-eu.eu. Now to today's topic. Space, as we know, is a vital domain as much as it is contested. The European Union is at a critical juncture in defining its space policy, which is essential not only for enhancing its capabilities in communication, monitoring, surveillance, and so on, but also crucial for advancing its strategic and autonomous external action. Space assets are a profound influence in everything in our daily lives, from digital interactions and environmental monitoring to strategic security and defense operations. Now, the importance of space policy can be seen in various applications, for instance, in monitoring deforestation and compliance in the newest EU deforestation regulation, to assessing climate change impacts, to providing strategic communication tools for managing and preventing conflicts. In recent years, the role of space in security and defense has also expanded significantly, which is evidenced at the EU's strategic compass that emphasizes the use of space assets for areas such as intelligence gathering, particularly noted after the Russian invasion of Ukraine. However, the challenge of maintaining a secure and cooperative space environment grows as much as space becomes crowded with both state and private actors. Now, this webinar will dissect the complexities of the EU's evolving space policy amongst these shifts that I just described. We hope to identify the potential for further European cooperation, while at the same time the EU can navigate the contestation of space itself. To shed light on these issues, I'm very happy to welcome a stellar group of experts. Kai-Uwe Schrögl is Special Advisor for Political Affairs at the European Space Agency. Giulia Pavesi is our colleague here at the Leuven Center for Global Governance Studies. She's a researcher in international space law. And finally, Marco Aliberti is Associate Manager and Lead on International Engagement at the European Space Policy Institute. Thank you very much, all three of you, for being here with us today. I suggest that we start with Giulia, followed by Marco, and finishing with a view from the ESA, from the European Space Agency, with Kai-Uwe. Now, as you know, most of you watching us for not for the first time, each of the panelists will give us an initial talk of around 8 minutes, which will be then followed by a Q&A session. As usual, you can ask your question via the Q&A button that you find at the bottom of your screen. First come, first serve. Don't wait until the end of the webinar to ask your question, so that you can be sure that it will be passed on to the experts. Without further ado, thank you again to our experts. Giulia, the floor is yours for your initial intervention.
Thank you very much. So I think a good, apologies in advance for the voice. A good frame of analysis to start the discussion is to start exactly from where what Gustavo mentioned. Today, it's widely recognized that space is a congested, contested, and competitive domain. All these elements that currently characterize the space environment and space activities pertain then to different dimensions that are space safety, space security, and space sustainability. So when we address the position of the European Union and the developments at the European Union level in relation to space governance in general, we have to look at it through the lenses and through the initiatives pertaining to each dimension. European Union, as mentioned, has demonstrated really unprecedented ambitions in the recent years in the space domain, both through a very substantial budget allocation compared to previous MFF, but also to a reorganization and the clarification of its European institutional framework for space governance. At the same time, this institutional reorganization has been backed up and complemented by some legislative and regulatory measures, addressing to some extent most of the dimensions of space activities in relation to safety, sustainability, and security. Of course, if on the one side these developments have been motivated both by an internal dimension, as the European Union became a larger space power, if some people consider it a space power. On the other side, it is also a product of the developments at the international level, and particularly by a diversification of space actors, the proliferation of space-related challenges, but also by an increased, let's say, contestation to some extent of the legal instruments that so far have addressed and have regulated space governance. While I can come back on the treaties, as I don't think is the most relevant part for this talk and due to the time limit, I will simply start by describing at least what have been the major initiatives from the European Union. While for the reorganization of the Union in itself at the institutional level, we certainly have a milestone with the 2021 space regulation. This also marked basically the gathering of all the different components of the space program, of the European space program, in a single program, and the designation of an entity at the European level of a decentralized agency through the European Union Space Program Agency for the European Union Program. On the other side, through different measures, through the STM joint communication and through the recent EU space strategy for security and defense, the EU also defined more clearly its posture and its strategic and programmatic objectives in relation to all the dimensions of space activities. With the EU STM joint communication, for the first time, the EU, and even before that with the action plan, the EU established a new space traffic management flagship program, but also declared its intention to explore a possible participation in 3 of the 5 space treaties, namely the Rescue Agreement, the Liability Convention, and the Registration Convention. All these elements, and at the same time at the internal level, it also proposed to put forward a EU STM legislation next to non-binding measures for such as standards and guidelines for STM. These elements will have an impact certainly also in terms of space law, because through the acceptance of the 3 treaties, the European Union will infuse some of the provisions contained in these treaties with an authoritative interpretation, and we go to implement those different obligations contained in the different treaties then at the European level. So this is one element. The second element is an STM legislation. An STM legislation, bottom legislation, accompanied by standards and by guidelines, will translate somehow in a communitarian, at least, approach and understanding of specific concepts that right now have a relevance for space governance at the international level. So it will create a sort of regional understanding, or it will it will ensure consistent application of guidelines and standards in relation to STM. The second element then is that is very relevant for the EU engagement in international space governance is the recent EU space strategy for security and defense, which was adopted last year. Sorry. To this end, as part of the efforts that are envisaged in the strategy, there is that to define a STRA, so a common space threat response architecture, and to propose, once again, a EU space law. Also in this case, both initiatives have an impact also on both on the inside, on the internal dimension, and on the external dimension. On the internal dimension, the designation, the creation of a STRA architecture will mean that the European Union will have to coordinate at the member states level different prerogatives, but also different perceptions and understanding of space threats or space responses in a domain that right now is very scattered, especially in relation to the rhetoric that has been used by states in recent years to describe space security dynamics in this sense. On the other side, this will also mean to intervene on a sharing understanding, and that also has to be, and I can come back on that during the Q&A, also means to translate into a common response to eventual threats, eventual attacks, which once again has to be, first of all, grounded on the legal basis that we have at the European Union level, and second of all, has to take into account, once again, also the different interpretation that states have of the same behavior or of the same threat. Finally, a third element where the European Union has started to engage massively, I would say, is in relation to international space diplomacy. And here, both through these initiatives, but also through other initiatives such as the 3SOS initiative, show and demonstrate, let's say, a change of approach of the European Union in space diplomacy. Rather than starting with a top-down approach, as was maybe the case with the ICOP initiative, the EU now is trying to put forward a multi-step approach and a gradual approach, where it first uses the Union as a laboratory and as a regional platform to be a consensus, for then exporting this approach outside in the traditional fora for multilateralism, also in relation to space. So also this is a very interesting element, also vis-à-vis the role of the European Union and the limited role of the European Union within the United Nations context, as an actor in the United Nations context. Because through this initiative, the Union can gradually bypass the limitations given by its status within the UN framework, and yet contribute to the space security discussion and to the space sustainability discussion through regional means. I think that's it because of the time I have, so I can elaborate then more in the Q&A.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Julia, especially for highlighting in the end this idea that the EU is using its own efforts domestically as a laboratory for the actions that it does diplomatically. I'll certainly pick up on that in the Q&A later on. And now, without further ado, let's move on then to Marco Aliberti for a view from Geneva, right, Marco?
Vienna, but indeed there should be a closer linkage between Vienna and Geneva. Hello everyone, a real pleasure to be here with these two esteemed colleagues to discuss about the place of Europe within the global space arena and also the challenges that the current European space policy is currently confronted with, especially with regard to the transformation that Julia was alluding to. Now, after this excellent overview, of the many complexity, that surrounds the European, I would say, space policy making, which are not complete, because the EU is not the only actor involved in space activities at European level. And we are also have the privilege to have Dr. Cayuve here to represent the other side, another tip of the so-called governance triangle in Europe, the European Space Agency. But maybe what I wanted to do in my short intro remarks is to highlight a couple of potentially provocative points, not just for the sake of sparking the debate later on, Now, the first message that I wanted to convey is that contrary to what we often hear and read in even in strategic documents, for instance, in the very opening of the EU space strategy on security of defense, Europe as a whole is not what we call a global space sector, global space power. It's not a fully fledged space power. Certainly, Europe, we need to be aware that is one of the most experienced actor in the international space arena and operates one of the most prestigious space programs. No need to talk about Copernicus, Galileo, Meteosat from EUMETSAT, or the many achievements undertaken by the European Space Agency. At the same time, we cannot deny that Europe as a whole is still lacking the autonomous capacity to access, operate, and benefit from space across the full spectrum of space activities to support the fulfillment of objectives that it has autonomously determined. More specifically, if we put Europe in a comparative perspective with the three full-fledged space powers, namely the US, China, Russia, Europe still lags behind, in key micro areas, for instance, human spaceflight, just to name one, or space security, which not only entails, the many efforts we are running on space situational awareness and space domain awareness, but also the very controversial question of space control and so-called counter space developments, basically. But more generally, we also need to recognize that Europe as a whole does not possess full technical autonomy across the entire value chain, as European stakeholders still need to outsource many basic components and basic technologies, the most prominent examples being the EE components, so the electronic components. And this de facto creates a situation of dependencies towards external suppliers, most notably the United States. But also equally worrisome, I would say, are the things, are the autonomy dimension from a political perspective, basically, where Europe remains very, I would say, vulnerable to the influence exercised by third actors, both inside Europe and outside Europe. This is due, I would argue, to what also Julia was alluding to, this very complex, web of institutions, relations, multi-level sharing of competence between the different actors that compose the European space governance, and specifically the interplay between the national, the intergovernmental framework, or the communitarian frameworks, as often creating some sort of institutional misalignment that I'm arguing is often, I would say, or is impacting Europe's ability to develop a coherent space policy and to act in a proper manner. And this relates actually to the second point that I wanted to highlight. We have many successes, of course, to celebrate, but European space activities are not guided, and this is important to realize, by one single coherent, comprehensive space policy and diplomatic actions. On the contrary, we have many a tango of different and potentially conflicting space policy and strategies, that respond, to the interplay between the different constituencies, so the strategy of ESA, which is also in the making, the strategy of, or the subsectoral policy of the EU, and the strategy of the member states. Now, there is certainly a very successful cooperation on the programmatic side, and a lot of steps have been taken to ensure more coherence at European level. Still, I would argue that we are still suffering a little bit, in terms of consistency. I don't know, for instance, how much, our industrial policies are consistent, for space within Europe. Or also, we could look, just to name one case, at the different postures that we have been taking with regard to human spaceflight activities, and the impact that the different postures by member states have had on the diplomatic positioning of Europe, with regard to our partners, specifically with regard to the Artemis program. And then we recently saw the development and the failure, to secure, let's put a seat, on the future moon landing. And this, I would argue, is due to the fact that in Europe, there is not a real coordination mechanism, for decision making, and not a sort of control mechanism, that pertains to the implementation of the decision that we have taken at European level. And so we have a lot of, I would say, policy, and if we are to identify, what is the European space policy, what are the objectives, I think that, and this is another argument, that we still need to go back at 8 years ago to the 2016, joint ESA-EU statement, on a space strategy for Europe and on the objectives that it set forth. And this document is still key because it represents a sort of political convergences among the different players within the European space governance. What are the objectives here? Very general objectives, So maximize the integration of space into European economy and society, and I would also add security landscape. A second objective objectives to foster a globally competitive and innovative space industry. And then third, to ensure Europe's ability to access and operate in space in a safe and secure manner, and I would also add sustainable manner now. Clearly, these are very general objectives around which everyone agrees. But since, especially because those are very general objectives, they also leave a lot of room, for contending implementation pathways, that could be conflicting, for instance, and I'm happy to also have, Dr. Caviuve here, how do we approach, competition, in the global space economy, through commonly agreed upon trading rules or through subsidies, for instance, through protectionist measures, So there are a lot of questions. And this is actually brings us to the third message before I close, that I wanted to convey is that the European external action is not fully equipped with all the tools that it would need actually to tackle the challenges that Europe is currently confronted with. Certainly, we have taken and done a lot of progress in many fronts. For instance, Julia mentioned the EU space threats response architecture, or for instance, the setting up of the ISAC, etc. And my final argument is that there is still a long way to go and a lot of new tools and toolkit to be explored, in order to ensure that EU and Europe as a whole is capable of tackling the issues it is facing. Final message, 2 seconds. Of course, the EU space law we welcome and will provide important, solutions actually to the problem, but of course will not solve all issues. But then happy to dive into more details as we go into the Q&A. Over here for the moment. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thanks a lot, Marco, also for highlighting this need of further coordination, right? I was curious, and we can come back to that in the Q&A, if you mean also coordination amongst the member states, but also amongst the different European Union institutions, right? It would be interesting to know if they are also working hand in hand when it comes to space policy in there. Caviuve, on to you then for a view that goes a little bit beyond the European Union in that sense. I understand you would like me to share this screen.
Yeah.
Okay.
So thank you, Gustavo, for inviting me on that panel with Julia and Marco. I would like to present you only one slide. And this slide is, let's say, used by me for motivational purposes, because usually we know and hear, well, Europe is behind, well, we are only a junior partner, well, what shall we do, how can we improve? And Marco is absolutely right, we are not a space power as such, and read his book on measuring space power, which is absolutely excellent. And you will have also the empirical evidence, and Julia clearly pointed also out that Europe is not the regulatory superpower it is in other fields so far for space. And when you see that the European Union has not even accepted obligations from the treaties it should accept obligations, then how can we play as European Union a role in that respect? And I should mention that ESA as well as EUMETSAT have accepted the obligations under these treaties and are then also, let's say, more recognized actors. But now let me share with you 10 statements, and you will see in the discussion that these 10 statements are absolutely relevant, even if they not point at exactly the international relations aspects. So first statement is that Europe has started to regard space as a strategic policy area. And this is not trivial, absolutely not trivial, because it was not regarded as a strategic policy area 5 years or certainly 10 years ago. And we have coined that with the words that space and the space activities is more than only a space program. It's more than space as such. It goes much further into a lot of important and relevant policy areas. And Europe has understood that. And when I say Europe, I always mean what Marco said or called the triangle. It is member states, ESA, and EU all together. you cannot have Europe with only one of these elements, and Europe only works when all three elements work together. Now, second, European space governance between member states, EU and ESA, the triangle, is developing into a stable state. We saw too much infighting in the recent past, and we will see how the new Commission and the new Parliament will handle that, and I'm absolutely confident that we will be able to do that. And this will also be a very important element for a successful showing of Europe in the international field. Third point, our operational capabilities, and you mentioned already a few: Galileo, Copernicus, meteorological satellites, commercial telecom, and also their technological quality are really second to none. We can be proud of that. Our first generation of Galileo is already better than the fourth generation of GPS. So we don't have to hide, and we can achieve everything if we want to do that. And we should also mention Europe's space science program and science investigations, because what we are doing there, in particular in creating technologies which are breathtaking, flying through space for decades almost, and then landing on a tiny spot. This is fantastic, and translates then into other space technologies and operational activities. Fourth point, Europe is systematically closing gaps. And this is also something we do not see or also appreciate. ESA is doing that now with human space exploration. We have it with IRIS-2, IRIS-2, and we have it also with strategic technological components. We are doing that, and we are successful in that. Of course, it takes time, it takes coordination, but Europe is not only standing there doing nothing. We are actively identifying and closing the gaps. And we also understand, and this is not negligible, we are starting to understand that if we don't act now, the future costs of non-action and non-investment are really, really high. Fifth point, Europe will return to autonomous launch capabilities in June, but also then with additional small launches, and we will be stronger than before. US also had a gap in transportation of humans, and it returned stronger than before, and it will be exactly the same for Europe. Sixth point, Europe will find its way for an innovative space industry and supply chain by also avoiding monopolies and billionaires dictating the policy and the rules. I really don't like when everybody is so happy about Elon Musk. We don't need anybody like that in Europe, even if he has the biggest rockets, because this would absolutely distort the way we are doing business. But we also have to take care that we do not foster monopolies, in particular through consortia and things alike, because this is not good for, first of all, the industry, the competitiveness, and also not good for the public money which is spent. And it's not good what ESA has achieved throughout its 50 years of existence now, that all its members have the chance and opportunity to have industrial capacities. And this is a political achievement, and it's very important. Next point, we have a top qualified and motivated young generation, as demonstrated inter alia in what we have with business incubation and the competitions we see of the EU and ESA. Europe can also build on, but should better nurture, as I put it here, public interest and enthusiasm for space and its public value. We do that through astronauts, but it could be much, much better. And if you see how many topics we have to create European identity, let's use space actually also to do that further to the song contest and the Champions League, which are also fine and acceptable. Ninth point, Europe has understood the need for integrating space in its security architecture. Now we get closer to what we are discussing here in precise terms, but we need still to find practical ways to implement this soon. We have nice strategies, but we don't have capacities, and we don't have capacities on the European level. Because the member states are still playing the first role, and we have to see again the triangle of how to handle that. ESA, for example, is very closely cooperating and coordinating with EDA, for example, but also with member states. We have to see and find a way here in this absolutely crucial field to engage this triangle. Last point. Europe now knows better its allies and partners and will proceed on its path as a normative, principled actor. This is my wish also in international space cooperation, and Julia alluded also to that. Diplomacy and regulation of the global common space, and this is something where we also, as principled actor, Europe, for many decades now, should stress and keep driving on that path that we maintain that space is a global common, not open for national appropriation, freedom of use, and with our regulatory power also in the future, we will certainly be able, be it space traffic management, be it extraction of space resources, to really make an impact on the policy and also diplomacy and space lawmaking. So much from my side, a little bit of motivation also, and hopefully a good entrance also for the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you indeed, Kai-Uwe. I'm glad that most of the points that you made are actually quite positive, right? We seem to be going in the right direction in many areas. Now let's talk about then the hard ones, the hard points. And we have a few questions that already came in. I'll try to go through them by the order of appearance here. There's a question on the transatlantic dimension of the international cooperation in space policy from the point of view of Europe in that sense. And the question goes as follows: how do you see, and I think it's for all of three of the panelists, how do you see transatlantic relations developing in space? We see that there might be some divergence there. Well, the US, as we know, has a space force, but also has perhaps more participation of private actors in the space programs. And Kai-Uwe said just now that perhaps we don't need that much of a participation from private actors in that sense. So how do you see the transatlantic cooperation going forward despite of these disagreements? And if you could also zoom in into the Artemis Accords. They were briefly mentioned before. They refer to the joint exploration or common rules for exploration of the moon and Mars and so on and so forth. How do you see that evolving into a common position? So these are the questions that refer to transatlantic element. Now we also have a question in regards to the role of European North and Arctic areas in EU member states for the future of its space policy. As we know, we usually value quite a lot in space policy the areas near to the equator, but discussion goes in the other direction. So what's the role that those countries and those areas would play in European space policy? I also have a question of my own as a moderator, and I think all of you, all the three panelists, mentioned that the EU is taking the space program, space policy, in more strategic terms. And I would be curious to know what led to this development, right? Was it particular geopolitical developments and events? Here I'm thinking, of course, the Russian invasion of Ukraine and how space assets have proven to be quite crucial in that. Is it also perhaps the fast pace of the Chinese space program, right? How does this geopolitical development, how do they play a role into fostering a more strategic vision for the EU and for Europe as a whole in that sense? I would suggest that we take those 3-4 questions and we can perhaps start with Julia. We follow the same order.
Yes. Start by addressing certainly two elements of the US-EU dialogue and cooperation. Actually, the US-EU dialogue was restated and reinforced in the recent EU initiative. But in there, I think it's very important to, first of all, keep in mind something. When we speak about dialogue, it doesn't mean that we have to translate this dialogue into dependency. And for a long time, in very strategic operational fields as well, the EU has been very dependent, Europe, but the EU also has been very dependent on the US, for instance, in relation to SSA. SSA is a very strategic element for the European Union, also for the implementation of all its space policy. And for a long time, we articulated our European response to the need of having SSA first through a framework, a support framework, and then even when we developed it into a component of the space program, also there the budget allocation was not so significant. So it was more to secure that also that would have been part of the program, but not really a priority at the European level. So in that sense, we developed quite a dependency on the US system based on a series of bilateral agreements, of sharing bilateral agreements, where basically conditions were unilaterally determined by the US and their security interests based on national laws at the US level, which means that we didn't have any sort of bargaining power in that sense if we wanted to access such data. Another big limitation also at the time was that even to share them data among EU member states, the same data that we received based on different kinds of agreements, then it would have been very difficult to share the same data among EU member states. So of course this created quite a web of obstacles that was difficult to overcome. Now, actually, it has to be seen, and also is not public available, with the STRA and with the exercises, a series of exercises that now have a yearly they take place on a yearly basis. The EU is developing a framework and an answer, also fusing data coming from different countries, and is trying to somehow create first a EU autonomous and indigenous capability network to establish sharing mechanisms, to establish data policies at the European level. And this, of course, will have then an impact outside in relation to its relation to the US, in the sense that the EU will arrive with a series of data policies or sharing mechanisms that have been already agreed at all member states level and on which it will be able to leverage then in discussion with the US. On the other side, also in terms of capability development, also in that sense, and in relation to especially the security and defense part, the EU has started to exploit the cooperative framework, also industrial cooperative framework, that it has at the EU level to develop capabilities. And while the rhetoric has always been that we should ensure complementarity with the US, certainly to ensure complementarity, we need to have a certain level of autonomy so that complementarity is not dependency once again. So in that sense, complementarity means that we will play on both sides, internally and externally. So externally, this certainly will leverage our negotiating power with the US. Another element where the US is relevant, before I mentioned that also in relation to the regulatory approaches, we are seeing, together with the traditional UN fora, we are seeing a series of parallel initiatives to develop space law or space regulation outside of the UN context. And this has been the case, of course, also in relation to the US and the EU. I mentioned before the initiatives at the EU level, which are certainly initiatives to develop space law within the European framework and then eventually to transpose some of these concepts outside. But we have seen it also on the US side, for instance, the very famous Artemis Accords And the Artemis Accords have been a series of unilateral statements signed by the US together with other countries that constitute a political commitment to the principle of the Accords. But so actually they refer to the preservation of outer space, to a lot of principles that per se should be actually quite accepted, but they still provide a unilateral interpretation. So it's actually quite, they might first of all undermine the consensus base and the UN-centered, let's say, multilateralism within space law. But also they could actually jeopardize the proper application of the different principles contained in the Outer Space Treaty. And also in this context, while we saw that the EU is developing its own regional European approach, and the US is in parallel developing its own national approaches, but also then this parallel international initiative, all these will have to be coordinated. So their coordination will be key. So yes, here the two elements that I would underline are those ones. In relation then also to whether the geopolitical context influenced the EU approach to, especially to the element, for instance, of space security and defense, actually it's very interesting to see that if you see the language of the compass and then the language of the space strategy, the rhetoric changes a bit, and the EU is much more assertive, for instance, compared to the compass. So, of course, the geopolitical elements affected the European Union approach. They also affected its approach in relation to more subtle threats in relation to space, especially after the Viasat jamming and so on. The EU became much more aware that the security dimension of space activities should encompass not only the traditional kinetic threats, but really the whole spectrum. And in this, it started to engage massively. Yes, I think I can stop here, but yeah, I can elaborate more.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Julia. Marco, on to you. I was just going to rephrase the other two questions that we also had on the role and place of the Arctic in that. That's one question that, if you want to tackle, Marco.
Yes, absolutely. I'll try to be quick and complement also the comprehensive answer of Julia on a few points. Then on the future of the EU, of transatlantic relations, let's put it this way, let me reiterate, there is a strong cooperation on multiple fronts, for meteorology, to exploration, Earth observation, already ongoing, and this will continue. What we have identified in a few years is that we need to collaborate more closely with the US, actually, on matters that have become, more prominent, on matters related to space safety, for instance, the proliferation, the orbital congestion problem, with the deployment, of so-called mega constellations, and also on security related matters, those are, I would say, issue areas: safety, security, sustainability, let's put it this way, where in EU policy documents, we have recognized the US as a like-minded, for obvious reason, partners that we want to engage with in closer coordination and cooperation. That should not, of course, obscure the fact that we do not necessarily have the same interests or objectives, when it comes, for instance, to devising rules, for instance, when it comes to space traffic management, for instance, since was mentioned, or SSA data sharing, or the setting up of standards, So there are areas in which, of course, we recognize cooperation as important, but in which I would say the approach taken by the US confront us with main issues. And these, again, to be quick, was mostly evident in the issue of the Artemis Accords. The Artemis Accords really underscore, and this was the take that I wanted to highlight before, the lack of a sort of common European approach, to partners. As Julia said, they are bilateral, I would say unilateral statements, that are then negotiated bilaterally, and really showed, because of course, like the US is always has the upper hand, when it comes to bilateral agreements rather than, interface, and is always stronger when interfacing with individual member states rather than the Europe as a whole, And so approach, individual nation states, individually, basically. What happened is that basically, many European countries signed the Artemis Accords at the beginning, basically, when they launched in 2008, so we had Italy, UK, Luxembourg already signing the accords, and other states still, on a more, I would say, concerned mode, for the reason that, the accords actually have a broader implication, than the specific cooperation on the accords, and because especially there was a disturbing link, between the acceptance of the principle contained, in the accords and the possibility to cooperate with the US, on the future Artemis program, basically. So basically, it is true that, as Julia said, the accords basically and contain principles that do enjoy a wide consensus, within the international, I would say, legal regime. For instance, peaceful purpose principle, rather than the pre-prevention, the emergency assistance. But there are also elements that do create, or do raise some legal issues. For instance, there are a few provisions related, for instance, to the establishment of safety zones and the confliction of activities, or the utilization of space resources that may raise divergent interpretation. And also in Europe, we had divergent interpretation, on those tools. And I'm also alluding to what Cayube said about, the way we look at space as a res communis, as a global commons, that is not subject to the national appropriation. What I'm saying is that, again, the principle enshrined in the accords have way broader implication, just than affirming, a few general principle, of cooperation, and this, I would say, is important to be aware and to have, a common response, on Europe on that front. That common response, unfortunately, was completely lacking, with member states going, in the direction, that better served their national interest, Now we have seen, that gradually the US has been able to sign accords with most European countries, not the entire, not the totality of European countries, but most European countries. On the side of ESA, this is, I would say, technical agency, so it is not the role of ESA, actually, in my view, to sign the accords, because ESA can cooperate with NASA on a programmatic level. While on the EU side, the answer would be, but I'm also interested to hear the views of my other two colleagues. The EU is not involved in space exploration, and I don't know whether there is a role or a need, actually, for the EU to sign the accords. Also, the question is, can the EU sign the accords, and would it convey the views of all 27 member states if it signed the accords? And so, again, this highlights a sort of lack of, I would say, coordination or shared understanding, on a few things, when it comes to space diplomacy. Then, with regard to, of course, to the Arctic region is becoming an extremely important region, especially from a security perspective, and there is a need and there is a strategic role the space assets play already and will play more in the future, in order to at least monitor the activities that are taking place in the Arctic. The EU has, I would say, an increased interest, I would say, in Arctic region and in the utilization of space assets, actually, to monitor the activities in the Arctic region, and is stepping up cooperation also, for instance, with Arctic countries such as Norway, but again, also the United States, in those regard. Now, with regard to the last question, actually, yes, the geopolitical developments that we have seen, including the war in Ukraine, or, what we see also in the crisis in the Middle East, and in general, the faster unraveling, of the global order is really indeed providing momentum, for the Europe and the EU to step up, in the realm of security and defense, and also, to create some momentum, for member states actually to enhance their level of collaboration. This is true. More in general, there is also the recognition of what Cayube was mentioning before about the strategic importance, that space is the revolution space that Cayube was mentioning at the beginning, that space is playing in our, for strategic purposes, and important that our reliance, on space assets for any purposes, including security, defense, but also economy and society and societal purpose, compel us actually to step up, in the process of how do we ensure protection of our infrastructure, which is a critical infrastructure in a sense, and this we recognize. And this, of course, raises a lot of, I would say, implication on the way we approach space. Let's put it in an even more simple fashion. The fact that we rely on space is forcing us, for more and more purposes, including security and defense purposes, is forcing us actually to protect space, against the rising threats, that these developments, such as the war in Ukraine, have shown. I hope I was not too long, or at least in the
No,
answer.
thank you so much, Marco. That was a very, very good insights on those questions. Kai-Uwe, if I might also add a more focused question on the role of the private sector, right? You mentioned that sort of in passing, but if I could add that also to the already going on questions on the transatlantic cooperation and also on the geopolitical events that have led to a more strategic perception and of the EU space policy.
Yeah. First of all, to rule out the misunderstanding, you alluded or indicated to that we are not interested or in commercial activities or that this would be a second chance. No, not at all, not at all. It's just what I said. We don't want monopolies. We don't want billionaires who dictate what we should do, and where we are dependent on, and which dependence is even worse than the dependence on the US government, even the under a government we might not like. So this is the thing we will have to avoid also internally. And then ESA is currently doing a real revolutionary change in that we set up also procurement mechanisms which are completely new to us as an agency, which is to enter into service contracts, which brings much more responsibility to the industry. So we also make competitions, challenges, as we call it, for companies who would then have ESA as an anchor customer without us dealing like a traditional agency of determining every single step. Of course, we maintain that for particular areas, but we also enter this new type and way of new space activities, but with a European touch and with a European eyesight. Let me also, while I have the floor on that, react to the term that ESA is a technical organization. I heard that. I don't know who said it, but of course, ESA is a technical organization, but it's also a political organization. It's a multilateral organization, it's a multilateral governmental organization, and it's an integration organization. Read the convention, which will have its 50th anniversary next year on the 30th of May 2025. We are an integration, a European integration organization. And I tell you, if you think there could be a European or an EU space policy or international diplomacy whatsoever, you cannot and will not be able to do that without ESA. And Gustavo, you did not mention in your introduction ESA once. It will not work. You also did not mention the member states once. And I refer back to what Marco said as the constituting elements, and they are also contained in Article 189 and other articles in the European Union treaties, that this is a triangle. And there we come to a number of interesting points, in particular in the security field. In no field, the Union is, let's say, worse off than in this field, because the member states keep their competences. And you should see, we had just now the Colorado Springs conference, where all the European national space commands were lining up and having their exchanges with the US Space Command and Space Force. And we see that the US is inviting also these member states institutions to their coordination activities with space commands. And this even strengthens then the member states' capabilities, capacities, and also advantage over the EU and also over ESA, of course, in that field, which means that the efforts of the EU institutions together with the member states and ESA should be stronger to set up a better understanding inside Europe of how this could then lead to a real, truly European Union, or European as I call it, because we should not start by thinking who is in the lead, who directs the others. How we can organize that Europe can speak with one voice. And there, I must say, and Julia pointed that out, one of the worst examples is Artemis Accords. The Artemis Accords in such, they are good. They try to come up with an idea of how to implement the obligations from the treaties. This is, by the way, the reason why the EU cannot sign them. It's useless to sign them because they don't acknowledge the obligations from the treaties. But what is really worse is the hub and spoke approach of the US. We do that one by one, as Julia pointed out, all unilateral. And Europe, where is Europe? Well, we have been divided from the beginning. It's not so bad, I must say, and it's good that this initiative comes. But this is not the space diplomacy we are talking about, and this should have come from a triangular approach and look into. Another point, last point from my side, we are now having the Space Council, the ESA-EU Space Council, where the two councils of the institutions meet together. And the topic is competitiveness of the European space industry, but also how space can make the overall European industry more competitive. And it has internal as well as external impacts and requirements. And in particular, when we look at the global space economy, which might reach 1 trillion by the year 2040, we have to come up with an idea of how to organize that on the one hand, and then how also to have our industry in a position to capture markets in a way which is beneficial for us and also then for those whom we are cooperating with. And these are the points where I think the Union should also take more efforts because it has the leverage for that, work with ESA, work with the member states together, and then try to come up with an idea of how to make Europe a real player in these global space economy and the international markets.
Thank you so much, Kyubi, also for highlighting this constellation of actors, as you say. Mea culpa, I did not mention all of them, but indeed, it seems to me that a major challenge going forward is indeed to find not only a division of labor, but also opportunities for further coordination between all of those as well. And one of the other insights that I'm taking from the debate is that much of a successful space policy, of course, has to do with technology, has to do also with integration into security and defense assets, but a lot of it goes through diplomacy, right? And a lot of it goes through a united European front in many of those negotiations. I want to go back to Julia now for some final words, and perhaps to Marco as well, with a more concrete question that we just got from the audience, which is, what can, at the end of the day, concretely, the European Union do going forward now to be a better actor in space? First with Julia and then with Marco.
This is a very broad question. Now, let me also just add something in relation to what was said before about ESA. Because what I would like really to convey is that it's true, we really work on three foundations at the European level, which is ESA, EU, and member states. So when before I presented the initiative at the EU level, is because at the EU level we had an unprecedented action and an unprecedented set of initiatives. So the EU seems to really at least have tried to follow, defined a route to follow. So try to define priorities at the EU level. But define priorities at the EU level doesn't mean being autonomous for what have been the partners since the beginning of the European space age and even before the European Union was there. So in this sense, also it's very important, before actually I think also Cayuve mentioned that ESA was collaborating with EDA. There is a joint task force existing between ESA, the Commission, and member state and EDA, which means that even in the identification of the critical space technologies now to meet the EU objectives, ESA plays a crucial role. And another thing that is also very interesting for ESA as a role on which, as an actor on which to rely, is also in relation to matters that have both an operational and a political dimension. For instance, in relation to cybersecurity policies and practices, for which ESA, because of its institutional structure and because also of how it works then internally with the different member states and companies at the very level, it's that it was able to set up some standardized procedure and some relevant standards that could have also a very big implication and a very big relevance for the European Union. So yes, I think also what we should take from that is, and is actually one of my remarks, is that it's true that the EU is gaining more and more autonomy in space, but it shouldn't forget, and I think it's not forgetting, to work with its relevant partners. The second element, however, is that I think on some issues, especially in relation to security and defense, the EU took a bit was a bit a victim of the trend, in the sense that it defined its ambitions, very big, high ambitions in relation to space security and defense, but without having very clear yet, which is the process, of course, how to then concretize them in terms of capabilities, in terms of coordination with member states, because it's still an intergovernmental matter, and also in relation to external frameworks, such as the NATO one. So also that is an element in which clarification is very much needed, especially in relation to threat response mechanism, in relation to threat identification, and in relation to identification of capabilities. So certainly I would define that. And a fourth element in relation to funding. So how to coordinate the different development capabilities and industrial development frameworks that the EU has, and that until now, also in relation to space programs, sometimes, especially in defense matters, have not been so efficient. So in my case, I think that those are some very urgent and quite needed areas of intervention.
Fantastic, and thank you so much, Julia. Marco, to you with a question that I usually do not ask, but since it came from the audience, I mean the concrete actions that the EU can take going forward.
Okay, yeah, no, very good. Will be, I would say, very short on this front. We don't simply need coordination, we need synergies between EASE and the EU. It's not just a matter of coordination and how to better integrate actually the excellencies and all the competence that ESA has, and also in support of the European external actions. I think there is a lot of room, and possibilities here to be explored. And then a second measure, that we should never overlook is we need to step up the budget, actually. I mean, we need to raise the cost of the non-action, but we also need to, I would say, scale up our level of ambitions in multiple fronts, starting from human spaceflight, but also security and defense. And basically, bigger budget means bigger market, a bigger share, and a bigger pie with the rewards, and eventually the possibility for Europe to become a full-fledged space power. There is a lot at stake, and we need prompt action actually in the coming years, and we can go along, without stepping up the budget.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Marco, and thank you to all of you. A lot of it goes through funding then as well, it seems. I'm afraid we are running out of time. We try to keep it to 1 hour discussion here, but we're going to have yet another engaged debate next week. This section will be available on the Engage website, and there you can already find recorded webinars on topics such as sanctions, trade in the geopolitical turn, EU-US relations and transatlantic relations. We touched upon that quite a lot today. And there's also a recorded webinar on the EU's Indo-Pacific strategy and much, much more. Our next Engage webinar is in a week's time. We will take stock and discuss the EU's multi-layered response to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, 2 years into the conflict. I hope to see many of you there next week as well. You can register to the webinar by visiting the Engage website. Thank you to Marco, Caiuve, and Julia for joining us today, and I hope to see many of you next week. Until then, goodbye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.